And I would like to introduce our first presenter, Dr. Heidi Ann Hahn. Dr. Hahn serves as the Director of the Engineering Capability Development Office at Los Alamos National Laboratory. She is responsible for developing and implementing enterprise systems engineering processes and practices. Dr. Hahn is also past president of the International Council of Systems Engineering, Enchantment Chapter. Heidi received a BA in psychology from George Washington University in 1980 and an MS in applied behavioral science in 1983 and a PhD in industrial engineering and operations research from Virginia Tech in 1986. And we'd like to welcome you and your presentation.
Thank you, and good afternoon. So you might wonder about what a systems engineer is doing up here talking to you about behavioral science. And the little rundown of my academic background will give you a clue. I went through my undergraduate and graduate in industrial organizational psychology and changed majors between my master's and my PhD. I wouldn't really recommend that unless you have a real penchant for graduate school, because I spent 6 years there, but it worked out okay for me. So it's not as strange a bedfellow as you might think, simply because my area of concentration was human system integration. So that's kind of by way of background. As a preface to this talk, I want to say that I gave a plenary at IREPS 2012 that was called Planning for Action Research, Looking at Practice Through a Different Lens. And in that talk, I asserted that behavioral science researchers, including myself, often do what I call backing into action research. That is, they start out to do some kind of a process improvement or a product improvement and end up finding something that contributes to the generalizable body of knowledge. And that's what happened in several of the projects that I was associated with at Los Alamos. So I talked about that, and I also asserted, though, that if we had started out with an action research frame of reference, we would have had more robust contributions to the body of knowledge, and that we probably would have done a better job on the processes that we were trying to improve as well. So today, I will briefly review a comparison of action research and process improvement paradigms. I'm going to talk about 2 engineering ethics training projects that we conducted at LANL, one using a process improvement frame of reference and the other an action research frame. I talked about this morning, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about the substance of the research, but just try to illustrate the differences between the two in terms of what action research brought to the table. And then I'm going to close with a discussion of how interdisciplinary communication is embedded within the action research paradigm and how that also improves the knowledge gained. Sticky papers, sorry. So I know I don't have to lecture this crowd at any great length about what action research is, so just a brief review. Koch says the action research are methods that simultaneously improve whatever the subject of the study is while generating generalizable knowledge. And we see this used most often in social science interventions, organizational design and development efforts, behavioral health programs, and looking at the effectiveness of changes to systems that have humans in the loop, like enterprise business systems or human computer systems. I'm going to do a very brief overview of the action research cycle methodology that was put forward by Sussman and Everett in 1978. It's a 5-step process, where the first step is diagnosing, where an improvement opportunity or problem to be solved is identified. I'm going to regret putting all these animations in this, I can tell already. Action planning is when an alternative courses of action are considered. Action taking is when the selected course of action is implemented. Evaluating is looking at the outcomes of the selected course of action. And then specifying learning is where knowledge is built by describing the outcome given the situation that was under study. And this can very often serve as an input to a new diagnosis. I'm going to contrast this with a typical process improvement paradigm called the PDCA, or Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle, that was derived from W. Edwards Deming in the early 1950s. As the name implies, it's four-step process, the first of which is planning, where the targeted improvement and output expectations are identified. In the doing step, the change is implemented and the data needed to confirm or refute the expected outcomes is collected. In the checking stage, we will be comparing the actual outcomes to the expected results. And then in the acting, we look at the causes of the difference between the expected and the actual, and this may serve as additional input into the planning process, where either there are corrective actions that are additional improvements on the process, or that the goal state that was specified initially has to be changed in light of the new information. So to compare the two, if you look at these, it would appear, at least on the surface, that the specifying learning is the main difference between the two. And it's true that in the Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle, or the process improvement, generally the information generated is held within the enterprise. It's not contributed to the generalizable body of knowledge, as it is in the case of the action research cycle. But there are actually a lot more differences than that, and they're subtle. They both employ the scientific method, but they're epistemologically different, where the Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle is built on a positive epistemology, and the action research is on an interpretive epistemology. So yesterday we talked about discipline-specific cultural differences, and so I think action research and PDCA are an example of where there are cultural differences between the two frames of reference. Positivists generally assume that reality is objectively given and can be described by measurable properties that are independent of the researcher. So it's characterized by formal propositions, quantifiable measures, hypothesis testing, and the drawing inferences from a sample to a population. Interpretivists generally attempt to understand phenomena through the meanings that people assign to them. They don't typically specify dependent and independent variables, but rather focus on trying to make sense of emerging properties. So generally, it's practice or theory-based questions rather than formal hypotheses that are being worked on from an action research frame. Another difference that comes out of this difference in perspective is the differences in the type of data that are collected. And so usually in the Plan, Do, Check, Act kind of a model, the focus is on quantitative data, while on the action research, there's more of an observation of participants, more surveys, more interaction with the participants just in general. And so that also influences the perspective in terms of the role between the researchers and the subjects. Where in action research, there's a tight coupling between those, interaction with the individual group or organization that is the subject of the study, whereas in the Plan, Do, Check, Act, the researcher is held away from the subjects, and the subjects are just objects to study, not necessarily people to interact with. I made the comment about quantitative focus versus qualitative focus, and I don't mean to imply that it's all or nothing. It's often the case that somebody doing a process improvement will do, for instance, a customer satisfaction survey. So they'll have that kind of interaction with the participants. At the same time, in the action research, we used quantitative metrics. We used throughput, we used correct response rate, and I'll talk about all that here in just a minute. But it's just to say that the preponderance is quantitative for PDCA, qualitative for action research. So this is the cover slide from my IREPS talk, and I talked at that point about the project that we had used using a process improvement paradigm rather than an action research lens. I'm not going to talk about this in any detail, but I am going to talk about the problem that we faced, and I apologize to those of you who heard the presentation this morning because it'll be a rerun. So if you have something else to do for the next 2 or 3 minutes, just go right ahead. Okay, so the gist of the presentation was about how we used engineering ethics case studies to meet needs that members of our engineering community had to maintain their professional engineering or other professional certification credentials. And so in New Mexico, at least, there is a requirement that they have 4 units of ethics training every 2 years. We at Los Alamos have 1 hour each year for all employees. So we had a gap of 1 hour each year, for a total of 2. And we wanted to have a situation where the training that we were providing would have relevance in the LANO context and in specific to engineering. So we did look at bringing in vendor-provided training. There's not a lot available in our area. We're in a remote geographic location, about 100 miles from the nearest major airport. We have budget constraints as far as sending people for travel for training, and the online stuff that we found either wasn't specific to engineering or certainly did not have the same content that we would need for presentation. We have some, very specific things that we need to train our engineering staff on. For instance, export control would be one thing. The solution that we came up with, now, so here we're in a process improvement. We are needing to beef up our delivery of training modules. So the obvious solution was that we decided to develop an in-house training course. Okay, easy enough. Use the systematic approach to training, did a needs analysis, et cetera, and came up with a class that we initially did live in the classroom and then modified so that it could be delivered online. That didn't solve the problem, though, because it was a 1-hour course. They needed 2 hours. So we started looking at that, and we could have just said to everybody, well, go ahead and take it again. Next year, take it again. But that would not be very satisfactory to the learners of just having to repeat the same thing over and over again. And so we started looking for a different way of handling this and to be able to refresh their learning. And started looking to the literature to see what would best work for the adult learner population that we were dealing with. And I went in great detail about why we chose the case model method this morning, and I'm not going to repeat that here. But because we were really just interested in getting the people through the training, getting them their PDUs, and ensuring that we were refreshing their learning, we only collected 2 pieces of data. And those were throughput, how many people actually took the class, and then a surrogate for retention, which was the rate of correct responses on the questions that were presented in the cases. So in the keynote that I gave in 2012, I reflected on what might have been different in our project if we had taken an action research frame. So at the time, I thought, well, there's not going to be any change in the diagnosis. We still need to provide PDUs, and we still need to refresh the knowledge. Didn't think that there'd be any action planning or action taking differences. Our choices were guided by the adult learning literature and our own cost and logistical constraints, and those were all still going to be in place. We would have included measures of the pedagogical value of the case models. That's the one change that we did anticipate. And we thought that as a result, we would add value in terms of knowledge generation. So fast forward a little bit, and this is the cover slide of the presentation that I gave this morning. Because our need for delivering these PDUs is ongoing, we got an opportunity for a do-over, which is kind of rare. But so as we started developing the case studies in 2012, we started out with an action research framework from the outset. And so I'm not going to reprise the presentation from this morning. You can look in the proceedings or talk to me afterwards if you're interested in that. But I'm going to review some of the key differences that we found between the approach that we took here and what we had done previously. So we did two things. We modified the intervention itself and also the data that we were collecting. So we had been concerned all along that by taking these case studies and presenting them online, that we were missing out on a lot of the richness of the classroom kind of, or face-to-face kind of presentation of case studies. That comes from the interaction of the students with one another, of the instructor-student interaction. And so we had initially, when we first started with the case studies, we had built branching into them so that the students could explore, if they didn't get the answer quite right, either be presented with additional information or additional questions that would help them flesh out what was going on, or at least be provided feedback of why the answer they selected wasn't the best answer. In 2012, we continued to have that kind of niggling sense in the back of our minds that we still weren't really cutting it. So we added a seated moderated discussion board to the intervention. And then we also, in addition to collecting the throughput and correct response rate data that we had collected in the past, we also did formal feedback on the course, including feedback on the pedagogical value as well as the value that students saw as far as the course having an impact. And so there were two questions that were asked about that. They were asked, what is the likelihood that you will use this information on your job? What is the likelihood that you will share the information with a coworker or friend? And we based this on a survey by Thalheimer, which is talked about in the proceedings paper. It's kind of an interesting instrument because it really, rather than being the typical training course smile sheet that, did you like it, was the room too hot, those kinds of questions, it really ties the learner's assessment back to the learning objectives. So I'm not going to go into a lot of specifics about the results of the action research-based intervention, but what I do want to say is that we believe, and this is, I'm hoping illustrating, that we did obtain learnings about the value and impact of the information provided that were not previously available to us when we were not interacting directly with the learners to get that information. what we see here, these were the 4 learning objectives, and people were asked to say, you know, what do you think about the value of these specific, the information specific to these objectives. We also were pretty happy with our results as far as the probability that trainees would use what they were learning on their jobs and that they would share it with others. We also had learnings about the case method support of adult learners. So these principles here are from Knowles, who is kind of the father of andragogy, or the study of adult learning. Of, you know, these are the characteristics of adult learners that one should use as design principles when putting together educational and training for adults. And we found that they thought that the case method was better at supporting the tendency toward autonomy and away from instructors, in learning as being problem-centered and contextual with the case method. Everything else was equally supported by cases or presentations, but nothing was deemed to be better served by presentation. We were a little surprised by this because one of the things that you find in the literature about case-based methods is that it does try to incorporate allow the learner to bring their own experiences into play. And we had designed the cases to exercise different kinds of professional roles. So, you know, take the role of the engineer who was involved in the problem, take the role of the manager of that engineer as you work through the cases. So it was a little surprising to us that the case method didn't shine as well in those 2 instances. We also had open-ended questions on the surveys that we had never had in the past. We got unsolicited informal feedback in the past, but this was the first time we actually asked people their opinions. And so we got some nice comments. Case method puts a real-world perspective on the lessons, and especially when consequences of failure to behave ethically are demonstrated, it makes the lesson have meaning. We also got some negative comments, and those all had to do with the fact that ethical dilemmas are rarely right or wrong, black or white. So I'll read one of my favorites of those as well. Ethics can be black or white, but sometimes it is gray or striped or polka dotted. These gray areas are the hardest thing for engineers to come up with the right answer. And so that actually served to validate a theory that we had that the issues around case methods that the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations had written a white paper that basically said, well, that was kind of an inherent weakness of the case method, that the squishiness was an inherent method. And we think that it's probably not so much about the case method itself as about the subject matter that we're trying to teach with the case method. So I'm going to go back to what I had said in 2012 about that if we had used an action research frame, we would have done some things differently and had better learnings. Turns out I was kind of dead wrong about my own diagnosis in a lot of respects. So I had said that we would not have a change to the diagnosis, but we did. We did still have to provide PDUs and refresh the knowledge, but we also now had an explicit part of the problem statement to say we needed to do that in ways that were responsive to the adult learner. We said there wouldn't be any changes to the action planning or the action taking, but then we added the discussion board. We said that we would have included measures of pedagogical value, and we did do that, but we also then directly measured the value and impact of the particular learning intervention. The one thing I was right about, I think we did add value in knowledge generation. So I said that I would finish up by talking about interdisciplinary communication in the case model project. And I want to do that by, again, going through the action research cycle and talking about the differences in how we approached that when we were using a process improvement kind of a framework versus once we moved to the action research. So in the diagnosing phase, the problem was identified by the professional engineers themselves. They were having problems getting the ethics PDUs. They came to me and said, Heidi, can you help us, right? So that was then turned over to training specialists who planned and implemented the solution. Initially, throughput was the only metric, and there was no specifying learning. Basically, the training specialists, we talked among ourselves, talked about the courseware, talked about whether the throughput was adequate, and continued having this conversation about, well, you know, what about this online issue of not having richness, right? So, as we, you know, went through the first iteration, and that was the online one-shot course, we said, need refresher training. Again, through the training specialists, introduced a different solution. This is when the cases came into play. Added correct response rate as a way to see if we were actually refreshing. And along about that time, you guys probably don't know it, but you influenced this cycle. And so I saw a call for papers about ethics-related education for IREPS 2012, submitted the paper, and the paper was accepted. So there we are. And it really was the case that we probably would have just continued talking to ourselves if I hadn't written that paper and then been invited to do this planning for action research plenary. So that got me engaged with a different community of practice and got me thinking about this project in a different way. So that was the point at which we added meeting the needs of adult learners to the diagnosing part. Still had the training specialists with responsibility for planning and implementing, but then the solution now included an option for direct engagement with the learners. The learners became directly involved in the evaluation, and we generated more robust information about the value, impact, and effectiveness of the intervention. I've said now several times, and we also generated new knowledge about how well case methods serve the needs of adult learners. So I've said several times that we had this niggling feeling about online delivery of the cases that I talked about this morning. So that then caused us to add a diagnostic around the efficacy of online presentation of case studies. But that was never actually officially put into the problem statement. So initially we had implemented branching. This time around we added a discussion board for direct engagement with the learners. That didn't actually work out so well, and I'll get to that in just a moment of why. We did not ask the learners themselves if they thought that this issue about lack of richness because of online delivery was actually an issue. Never engaged them on that. So what happened was that we ended up with kind of funny results with this discussion board. When we asked people on the survey about the discussion board, 20% of them said that they had visited the discussion board, and all of the people who had visited said that it added value. The problem was that not a single one of them had contributed one word. They were all lurkers. And so what we don't know now is online augmentation even needed? Did they not contribute to the discussion board because they weren't motivated to do so, that it was solving a problem that wasn't there? We just don't know. And we don't have the data that would allow us to find out. So the cycle is kind of continuing. So in the proceedings paper, we anticipated thinking about, well, maybe we'll try to do some way to incentivize them, and we're rethinking that because it would be much better at this point to go back and ask them, is this a problem, and is it a problem worthy of solving? So we're not planning to do anything different with the discussion board as we go into the planning cycle for the 2014. So, I'm sorry, it's not so bad there. It's on the screen, I can barely even see it. Yesterday we talked a little bit about the differences in the terms interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary, and you'll see that I've kind of sidestepped that whole issue. By referring to communities of practice that have different skill sets within themselves, which was one of your definitions of interdisciplinary, and then have overlaps in skill sets between the communities of practice. So when all of this was just within the training community of practice, when we started out, we were able to solve the problem that had been identified, getting the PDUs, and we were able to have our research on pedagogical models and so on and so forth. My interactions with the action research community of practice led to a whole new approach, influenced the design, and then led to the trainees' engagement with the community of learners. I also think that that is leading me to a new insight about the need to get the information about the richness question answered, so it prevented me from making mistakes, so good catch, thank you very much. And then the final slide, I hope that in this brief time I've been able to provide evidence that the knowledge gained is greater through application of an action research cycle, that interdisciplinary communication is embedded within the action research paradigm, and that the introduction of interdisciplinary communication also enriches the knowledge gained. Thank you. I'm sorry I went 2 minutes over.